beginning of Living with an Open Heart, we started people off with meditation and a little bit of quiet sitting as a preparation to read the book, and so we'll do that now before the book launch too. Okay, so just put your hands in your lap, lower your eyes. Do a quick check-in with your body, and if there's any tension anywhere, then release it. And then bring your attention to the breath. Sitting here, breathing be normal and natural. Don't force it. And for a minute or two, just be aware of the gentle inhalation and exhalation. Be aware of how your breath connects you to the rest of life. And also be aware of how the breath is constantly changing, never remaining the same in a second moment. Let's just have a moment to settle our mind like this. And then before we begin the talks, let's join our meditation and think that we want to learn how to live with an open heart so that we can not only be happy ourselves, but so that we can make a positive contribution to society, to all living beings everywhere. And to realize that by ourselves generating an open heart, through the ripple effect, we're able to spread more peace and harmony and compassion to all those around us, and then spread it to others. So with that kind of motivation, then let's share it today. And open your eyes and come out of your meditation. Okay. So, I thought to tell a little bit of the history of the book. And Russell, please correct me if I get anything wrong. Okay? Because people are usually, they're quite interested in the inside scoop of what happens when you write a book. How did the book come about? Yeah, because the book has its own kind of life, so to speak. So Russell and I have known each other for a number of years. And I've attended some of his talks at Eastern Washington University, where he's a psychology professor, and he's also been up to the Abbey to give a talk. And, in our friendship, we talk about the similarities between psychology and Buddhism, and especially in the emphasis of in compassion-focused therapy, compassion-based therapy, the emphasis on compassion, on love, as a way of treating one's own mental discomfort, one's own mental problems, the role of compassion. And so one day, Russell said to me, hey, I would really like to write a book about compassion based on Buddhist ideas and principles, but, showing the commonalities between psychology and Buddhism. But let's not make it for a Buddhist audience. Yeah. And so I felt very honored to be asked to be the Buddhist co-author. but, you know, being the Buddhist co-author, but without being Buddhist when I read the book. Okay. So, it's because I want to make real clear, the book is not, the audience we were writing for is not Buddhist. That was not our intended audience. You know, our intended audience is everybody who thinks love and compassion are good qualities and who want to find a way to develop those qualities in their own mind. Yeah. And so that's our audience. So it's meant for, you know, people of all religions and people of no religion. Yeah. Completely secular people. Because, as His Holiness Dalai Lama, and you know, emphasizes with this idea of secular ethics, you know, there are certain ethical principles that you find in different religions, but are also found in secular society, and different ethical values that can be promoted without having a theology or a religious philosophy behind them, but to promote these ethical values simply because they're good for people. You know, and they promote human happiness. They promote individuals to be peaceful within themselves. They promote better behavior amongst others. And so a lot of these values are things that are talked about in Buddhism as well as in other religions that everybody can agree with. Okay? For example, not harming others. Now, of course, different people have different definitions of what harming means. But just the general idea, you know, of not killing others and not taking their property and speaking truthfully and not ruining people's reputations because of jealousy. You know, these are commonly held values in society, regardless of the fact that people practice them better or worse, you know. Regardless of that, they're still commonly held values. Things like forgiveness, being kind to others, showing gratitude for others' kindness to us. You know, these are things that everybody can agree with, no matter what religion they're from, or even if they're free thinkers. You know, because these are values that we need in society, simply so that we can live together and all stay alive together. Because if we don't respect each other, then none of us are going to be able to stay alive. Okay? So the book was written in, you know, with that kind of audience in mind, not as a Buddhist book. So it was interesting for the two of us to work together, because I would write my sections and Russell would write his sections. And then we would look at each other's sections. And he's coming from a scientific approach, you know. I'm coming from a Buddhist approach. And so occasionally I would try and sneak some Buddhism in. And he would also sneak some science in. And so we had some interesting debates about what to put in the book. Okay, so any talk of rebirth was banned. Okay.
Not ban them from your entries.
So, yeah. But I banned him from talking too much about the brain causing our emotions, you know? So, yeah. So there were certain things where we decided we needed to modify each other's approach. You know, we were both entitled to our own beliefs, but just as far as we presented the book, we wanted to present it in a very neutral way, not saying that the brain was responsible for our emotions, and not saying that, you know, our karma from a previous rebirth was responsible for our habitual actions, but leaving that part out, yeah, and just concentrating on, you know, how to benefit people from a perspective of this life. Yeah. And we had this publisher in the UK publish the book. Russell had written a book on anger before with them. So it was quite interesting for me working with the UK publisher. I don't know if this is typically British or not, or if it was just the people we worked with. But in America, you use the word heart. You speak from the heart, you listen from the heart, you know, you talk, you can try to communicate from your heart to the heart of somebody else. But whenever we use the word heart in the book, our editors, you know, take out the red ink and make them rewrite this. Yeah. In Singapore, do you understand if we say that you listen to somebody with your heart? Yeah, you understand it, right? Yeah. Somehow our editors, they couldn't handle anything about the heart. They had some heart disease. So, yeah. So we had to rewrite those portions. And then also, I always like to relate Buddhism to societal issues. Yeah. And in the States, I can be, you know, quite vocal about that, depending on the audience, you know. And I apply Buddhist ideas to societal issues, you know, what's going on in the country, you know. So in the country, abortion is a big issue. The environment is a big issue. Women's rights, you know, is a big issue. Human rights, you know, all these kinds of things. So I wrote a chapter kind of applying some Buddhist ideas to these kind of things, also animal rights. So the publishers didn't like that either, so that chapter got deleted. But I put it on my website so you can read it there, unadulterated. Yeah. Because my feeling is, you know, it's good to apply our values to society as a whole. Yeah. But then we decided in the book, we'll just explain it in terms of individuals and then let people themselves figure out how to apply it to society in general. Okay? So that's what we wound up with. And one of the strong points in the book, I think, are the reflections that come at the end of each chapter. I've gotten a lot of feedback about having the reflections. I wrote some of them, but I got lazy at the end, and so thank you, Russell, for writing all the rest. So he wrote more than half of them. Yeah, but I think they really add something to the book because they give you specific points to think about after you've read a section. You know? So this is kind of, we call them reflections, but they're actually meditations.
Why didn't we call them meditations?
Because that's too religious. Although meditation is quite popular in the States now. Anyway, you can say meditation in public now. Yeah. So, but you know, because we really wanted people to think about what we talked about in terms of their own personal lives, because this is how you change. You know, if you just read the book, and you know, there's some parts here about anger and forgiveness and everything. If you just read the book and then you go to your spouse and say, hey honey, read this, it applies to you. That wasn't our idea, okay? Because we can always tell other people how the teaching on subduing anger applies to them and how forgiveness applies to them. But our purpose was, how do these things apply to us? Because that's the way we're going to change, okay? Not in telling other people that they need to control their temper, but in controlling our own. Yeah, so the reflections, you know, help you really think about these ideas in terms of your own personal lives. And I think that's what brings about a lot of change. We've had, the book has been out in the US for a few months. And so we've gotten some feedback about it, and we have a group in the Abbey teaches a meditation class at one of the very progressive liberal churches in Spokane, View. And they've used this book as the basis for the meditation class, because the people coming to the class, many of them aren't Buddhists, it's a church. And so they've found that people love the book and are really, really applying it to their lives. And they come home from it, from the session each week, and just tell us how impressed they are with how people are really looking deeply inside themselves and applying these teachings. And then I think somebody is developing a study guide, right? So on the ThubtenChodron.org website, we're having a page or a section for the book. And so when the study guide is ready, and we will put the study guide there, the idea being that then people can form groups, and we're hoping that, therapy groups or Buddhist groups or activist groups or whoever, just groups of friends will use, because many people have like book studies and book clubs and all, but then they can use this book and use the study guide with it, with discussion questions and all. Okay, so our hope really in doing this is to help people see that when we pull ourselves out of our self-centeredness and really from the heart care about others, that when we do that, not only do we feel better about ourselves, but our relationships also improve. Yeah. And I've long thought that, at least in the States, and I think here too, people suffer and struggle a lot with self-esteem issues. Yeah, feeling I'm not good enough. I know there's a lot of pressure in society. In Singapore, you have to work harder, you have to produce more. Yeah. I came here like over 25 years ago, and people are much more stressed nowadays than 25 years ago. Yeah. And that when the mind gets stressed and the mind gets focused on me and I have to produce more, I'm not good enough, what's wrong with me, all this kind of self-talk, it produces a lot of psychological problems. And it also becomes a handicap in whatever spiritual practice you're doing as well. Because as long as we think that we're not worthwhile, then, we can't go anywhere spiritually or psychologically. Yeah? So I think that the book, in teaching us to pull ourselves out of this self-centeredness, helps us a lot with self-acceptance. And self-acceptance helps us free ourselves from all this incredible mental criticism that goes on all day long, self-judgment that goes on all day long, and frees us from that. Also, when we have love and compassion in our hearts and in our minds, of course our ethical behavior improves. Because when we really care about others, then we're not going to beat them up. We're not going to take their stuff. We're not going to hurt them by misusing our sexuality. We're not going to deceive them through bad business deals and cheating people and so on, because we really care about them. And I think psychologically, this is just my hypothesis, I'm curious what you have to say. I think many psychological problems come not only from a low self-esteem, but because people don't keep good ethical conduct, and then they feel guilty about their behavior. Yeah, that's just a theory that I have, you know, by looking at my own mind, you know, that when I don't act ethically, then I don't feel good about myself. And not feeling good about myself is the basis for various psychological problems. Okay? So I'm hoping that the book will also help people, you know, improve their ethical conduct, feel better about themselves, have fewer psychological problems, and get along better with others. Not to mention having more honesty in business, politics, and everywhere else, where we can see that people tend to skip over honesty for the sake of making more money or being more famous. And so I think really good ethics are the foundation of a safe society. Okay? So, you know, and then also when we develop love and compassion, we feel good in general, and our relationships improve. Yeah. We were talking at one of the talks, I forget which one, some of you have been to the various talks I've been giving this last week, but we were talking at one of them about who do we say the most awful, cruel, mean things to? The people we love or strangers? Yeah, think about it. When you lose your temper and you go and swear and insult and deprecate, who is it towards more? The people you care about? Your family members or strangers? It's family members, isn't it? We would never speak to a stranger the way we speak to a family member. Yeah? And yet, we expect to have happy families when we don't control our mouth regarding our family members. You know? Somehow we feel that these people are so much a part of us that they have to love us no matter what. So we can just say whatever we want, do whatever we want, and they're stuck with us. But that's not exactly true, is it? They're not stuck with us. Yeah? And if we create the causes for an unhappy family, we will live in an unhappy family. And then we will be unhappy. So by learning to, you know, look at our own mind and regulate, you know, monitor what we're thinking, what we're saying, what we're doing, you know, we can definitely improve our family life right now and improve our relationships at work right now too. Yeah. And as I've been talking, you don't know the Singaporeans like I do. You know what they hate the most? Their bosses. Yeah. When I teach compassion, I have to stress you have to be compassionate to your boss. Because every time I come here, this is what people complain to me about. Yeah. First is their boss. Second is their spouse. Third is their children. Yeah. So these are the people that have to be the focus of your generation of love and compassion. Yeah? I'm serious. You have to have compassion for your boss. Yeah. Because if you have a kind attitude, it's going to change the whole feeling at your workplace. And that will benefit you as well. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
So, that was a wonderful introduction to the book. Before I make my comments, I'd like to begin with a brief practice as well, a slightly different one. You don't need to close your eyes. But I'd like you to actually allow your eyes to wander a bit, to maybe look around the room at one another. And when you do, when you see one another, when your eyes meet, I'd like you to see one another with the awareness that every person you see, every gaze that you meet, every person you see has a story that runs every bit as deeply as your own. A story filled with love and loss, hopes and dreams, suffering, heartache, and joy and peace. Let me see if you can feel that, get that. Everyone you see, just like you, only wants to be happy to not suffer, and has a life filled with all of these things. And as you see one another in this way, knowing one another in this way, I want you to imagine these fellow beings here with you. What sort of life would you like them to have? If you had it within your power to give them any kind of life, what would you want them to have? What would you want their lives to be filled with? Yeah. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that a group of Buddhists are wishing happy lives for one another. And so allow yourself to experience the joy of that, of wishing happiness to all these fellow beings, practitioners here. And perhaps the joy of receiving those wishes, with the awareness that everyone in this room has just sincerely wished for your happiness. So, I think these practices of wishing for the happiness of others, cultivating this capacity to really care about one another, is very important for psychological health and for healing the world. And in compassion-focused therapy, we talk a lot about different emotions and how when we experience different emotions, how we tend to think different things, we tend to pay attention in different ways, we tend to behave differently. And we know that when we feel threatened, our attention and our thinking tends to narrow, and it becomes very easy to focus on ourselves and to care only about us, and it becomes very difficult to care about others, very challenging. And when we're in the pursuit of something that we want, again, our focus can become very narrow. Oh, I want that. And I think many times when we're in these spaces feeling threatened or in pursuit of something we want, it's very easy to harm others without meaning to. It's not that we choose to harm them so much as they're just not part of our awareness. We're so focused on what we want or what we don't want that they don't show up on our radar screen. And so this book for me was about helping us open our radar screens and helping others open their radar screens to the suffering and concern for all beings. And one really powerful way we can do that is by helping ourselves and others feel safe. Because when we feel safe, and I'm speaking as a scientist now, there's a lot of scientific literature that shows that when we feel safe, our attention opens, our ability to think flexibly opens. We naturally become concerned about the well-being of other people. And this is not just Buddhists or psychologists. This is the way it works for us as human beings. When we feel safe and the opportunity to help others arises, almost everybody will do that. And when we see people who quite frequently don't help others, very often it's because they don't feel safe or they're caught up so diligently in pursuing goals or money, that their radar screens are very narrow. And so I wanted to begin by having you look at one another and experience one another in this way, because a primary way that we as human beings feel safe is through connection with one another, feeling valued and accepted and liked. And so that's sort of how I'd like you to feel today. So, with regard to this book, I remember this was actually several years ago. This, for me, was really a dream in the making for quite some time. I had a number of Buddhist books, and several by Thich Nhat Hanh, who has written some wonderful books on mindfulness. And I had a couple of his that I would read, actually again and again. I would read them one entry every morning. Actually, Venerable Chodron has written some books like this with small, brief entries, and I read those. I'd be constantly working on them with my breakfast. Usually I would just eat, but I'd start by reading an entry in that book. And it occurred to me, as I really started doing compassion-focused therapy and writing and teaching these things, that I didn't know of a good book out there like that on compassion. And Venerable Chodron is absolutely correct. I didn't want to write a book for a Buddhist audience because, quite frankly, there are lots of really wonderful Buddhist books on how to cultivate compassion. So I didn't think that you needed a clinical psychologist to teach. Buddhists don't need someone like me to teach them about compassion, right? So I initially thought, well, what if we had a book like that for everybody, for lay people, that would have brief readings on how to cultivate compassion? Because I think some people, when they understand what compassion is, there are lots of ideas about compassion that aren't accurate. There are lots of people who think compassion means just being nice all the time, or letting people take advantage of you, or being weak and vulnerable and things like this. But when you get past that, then sometimes people think, well, this compassion business sounds very good to me, but I don't really have time to meditate for an hour a day. I'm not willing to create the space in my life to do the long extended practices and things like this. And from my own practice and what I've learned from numerous Buddhist teachers, including Venerable Chodron, I had become aware that actually what had transformed my mind equally the time on the meditation cushion, but also those moments when I was walking around and I just bring a compassionate thought to awareness. Those moments when I was walking around on my own, thinking about that, going through the mantra, bits and pieces, moments at a time, and bringing awareness of other beings and how they wanted happiness and didn't want suffering as much as I did, as I was going through the regular things I did in my life. And I thought, we need something that helps people learn compassion 30 seconds at a time. We need something that people feel like they can bring into every moment of their lives, not just the time they've set aside for meditation, but when they're in the boardroom meeting, when they're walking down the office, when they're riding on the train or the subway. And so that was really the inspiration for the book. And as I started thinking about it, although I didn't overtly want it to be a Buddhist book, I couldn't help but figure out that about half the entries that I was planning to write myself were based on Buddhist teachings. And it seems sort of silly for me as a psychologist to write those things, because although I've attended a lot of Buddhist teachings and I've read a lot of Buddhist books and I've learned so much, I am not a Buddhist teacher. And it didn't feel right to me to write entries as if I were a Buddhist teacher, particularly when 45 minutes north of Spokane we had such a wonderful Buddhist teacher. And so I was very honored, Venerable Chodron, when you were willing to come on board and do those pieces. And it really was a dream come true for me when this book came together. And it was not, Venerable Chodron will tell you, it wasn't easy. We faced challenges with publishers and things like this. One of our primary contacts with the publisher, who had worked and made my previous book completely easy, it just sailed right through, I think was facing some serious illness and just would disappear for like months at a time. You'd email her and you wouldn't hear from her. And poor Venerable Chodron had never worked with him. She said, "What's going on?" I don't know. I don't know, you know. But you keep going. And something's important. And this is actually something that Buddhists know quite a lot about. As a psychologist, one of the things that I really admire about the Buddhist tradition is the real recognition that real change, transformative change, takes consistent effort and much hard work over a long period of time. That it's not, you know, I don't know what it's like in Singapore, but I know in America, there's this sense that things should be quick and easy. Whatever you want, you should get it right now. Right? And it shouldn't be uncomfortable. You should always be comfortable. Everything should be really comfortable and go up. But we know intuitively that this is not true, don't we? We know that the things that really matter take work and effort over time. If any of you play a musical instrument, you know that probably you were very bad at that instrument for a very long time before you got any good at it. So there are lots of things, we know this, but yet in the culture there are these messages that everything's easy, it should come easy, it should come quick. And in Buddhist practice, there's this emphasis again and again on how do we keep going. You know, specific meditations on keeping the motivation high. So, very important things. So, one suggestion as you sort of go through life practicing, I'd encourage you to try and bring an awareness of your emotions to mind. Try to bring some mindful awareness in as you go about your day. Maybe 2 or 3 times a day. To take a moment to check in with your body. Just notice how your body feels. Check in with your emotions. Notice what emotions are showing up. Check in with your thoughts. Notice what you're thinking. And maybe think about those 3 types of emotions that I mentioned. Do I feel threatened? Do I feel driven? Do I feel safe? And that can be particularly useful if you're in a situation that's not working so well, or if you're with someone who you're having a hard time having compassion for, like your boss. If you can, when you're feeling very frustrated, try and notice, do I feel safe, threatened, or driven? Does he or she feel safe, threatened, or driven? And how are we impacting the other person? Because I can promise you, if you can find a way to first help yourself feel safe, maybe slow down your breathing. Take a moment to ask, if I were at my very best, my kindest, my wisest, my most confident, my most compassionate, how would I understand this situation? Or if you have a model of compassion in your life, someone you look up to, maybe you could ask, I wonder how this person would understand this situation. What would they think? If I were my kindest and wisest and most compassionate, how would I feel? What would I want to do? And if that difficulty involves another person, to maybe take a moment and imagine what could be going on in their mind. How does their behavior make sense from their side? We see how it doesn't make sense from our side. But if they're doing something, you know, there's a reason for it. And if we can understand that reason, it gives us an opportunity to communicate with them in a non-threatening way. And when we do that, they become much more likely to hear us. We can communicate with them from a place of compassion and safety. So I think that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
How do you remain compassionate when you find yourself that you are already at a moment that you are angry or insulted, or you know you have already passed that nice moment, and at that moment probably my thinking is probably like I don't care, I'm not a nice person, and I just want to lash out at that moment. So how do you still remain compassionate? Thanks.
So those moments are challenging indeed, right? So I think the most most important thing we can do at that moment is to be aware of what's happening. I think those times when we say or do really cruel things, it's because we haven't noticed that the anger train has left the building and we're on it, but we haven't noticed that, right? And so this is a really good reason for mindful breathing. Mindful breathing practice, for example, where you bring your attention back to the breath, and when it wanders, to notice that it wanders and come back. It's a very simple practice, but there are many things that happen in terms of training the mind. And one of the things that that practice trains us to do is to notice movement in the mind. By seeing when thoughts or feelings take us away and coming back, we're training our brains to notice those shifts. So that when we're in that moment that anger arises, we'll be much less likely to get lost in it and much more likely to go, I'm really angry. Now, if we can do that, once we notice, I'm really angry and I only want to be cruel, I only want to say something mean, at that point, once we've noticed, there are just a gazillion wonderful things we can do. At that point, there are many opportunities. Several are to be found here. So I'd suggest the first thing that I would do at that moment is to take a moment and slow down my breathing. And maybe I can't think any differently. Maybe I'm so angry, I'm just thinking cruel thoughts or whatever, but I can slow down my breath. And as I do that, that creates some space in my mind to then try and shift my attention in a way that it feels more helpful. So that would be my first answer.
In addition, we really need to practice working with our anger before the situations happen. Yeah. It's like, taking a test. You need to prepare. If you go in cold, it doesn't go well. And so I really encourage people, to read about the antidotes to anger and how to think. In this book, Russell's written a book about anger. I've written a book about anger. Read those and then take out situations that have happened to you in the past. And when you're alone, and none of those horrible, obnoxious, mean people are around, then think about the incident and apply one of those ways of thinking that is talked about, And at the beginning, it's like the new way of thinking seems so foreign, and it's like, how can I possibly think that? That's rubbish, But if you really have to work with your mind, it's like, okay, let's try it out. Let's try looking at the situation from a different perspective, see how it looks, treat our mind a little bit like you would a child, to get it to, think in a different perspective, and practice, that new way of thinking. And then do that kind of thing repeatedly in your daily meditation, using, all the various techniques for working with anger, so that you get familiar with a variety of techniques. And as that familiarity builds in your mind, two things happen. One is your actual way of looking at situations begins to change because of the new way of thinking, and you start from the beginning to look at the situation differently. And second, even if you've gotten on the anger train and you're looking at the situation in the old way, when you catch it, like Russell was saying, then you have more familiarity with switching your mind in a different direction by looking at the situation differently. Yeah. And a third benefit from doing this is by taking out all these old situations. Yeah. Sometimes we realize that our mind still is not completely settled about things that happened in the past. And we're still holding on to some grudges or resentment or anger. And it helps us, to process all of that and eventually to let go of that anger and resentment about things in the past. Okay? But like he said, it requires a lot of practice and daily effort. It's not, you know, let's do it once and then it works forever.
I have one last thought. One thing that can be helpful too is deeply understanding the nature of anger. Because our tendency is to take our anger very seriously. If we think of the angry self as like someone who's really loudly shouting at us to do something, we can see our anger carries with it a sense of felt urgency. When we're angry or when we're afraid, fear is the same way, anxiety is the same way. These threat emotions carry with them a feeling of urgency. And if we can learn to slow down and ask the questions, is this feeling that I have to do something now, is it true that I have to do something now? Does the situation actually demand me to say something? Or is this just the nature of this emotion that I'm feeling? And what you will find most of the time is that it has very little to do with the situation. That feeling that I have to do something now is the inertia of the emotion itself. And once we recognize that, we can take anger a little bit less seriously. Oh, there's my angry self. It can be useful to think of it like that. Oh, thank you, angry self, for registering your opinion. I appreciate that. But I'm going to let compassionate self take the wheel here. Similarly, anger is associated with a sense of certainty, of like knowing that you're right. This sense of certainty, and there are studies on this, has nothing to do with what's happening in the real world. I could split you folks, if I want to do a quick psychology experiment, I could split you into two groups and have you folks, don't do this by the way, but I could have you remember something that makes you very angry. Think about something, an angry memory, something, really get yourself worked up, and have you folks think of dumplings or something that doesn't make you angry. And then I could have you make a prediction about something that's completely unrelated, like who's going to win the World Cup next year. And if I then asked you that prediction you made about who's going to win the World Cup, how sure are you that you're right? From say a 0 to 10 scale. Have you rate how certain you are? The people who were angry would be more certain of their prediction than the people who were not. Even though the World Cup has nothing to do with what you're angry about. Right? So that's just the nature of angry. When we're angry, we know. Right? But we don't. In fact, we're much more likely to be wrong when we're angry than the rest of the time. Why? Because our thinking and attention is very narrow. And so when we understand the kind of nature of anger, and when you were talking about that visualization of going back through the previous situations, that's such an important thing to do. And I think, when you're doing that, you could even imagine, maybe before you bring up that memory of yourself in that situation you were angry, try to take a moment and connect with that feeling of being really kind. Try to imagine if you were at your kindest, your most wise, your most confident, your most compassionate. Bring up that compassionate self, that compassionate version of you. Imagine that you already have all those characteristics. And then imagine that you're seeing yourself, your past self, in that situation, getting really angry. And maybe imagine if I was there with that angry version of me, what would I want him to understand? What might I say to him to help him get through, to help him not act out or say the angry thing or things like this? And what we're doing there is we're developing the mental habit of seeing these perspectives from a compassionate perspective, and also the habit of being able to coach ourselves through them. And I think that can be very useful.
It's interesting to me to see sometimes the similarities of how psychology and Buddhism deal with a different point. This is what he was talking about, giving your previous self some advice, on how to handle the situation. What I often do when I'm in a difficult situation and I'm getting worked up is I'll think, if the Buddha were in my shoes, how would the Buddha look at the situation? Yeah. And surely, if I'm all worked up and the Buddha's not going to be looking at it that way. How's the person. And it really opens the mind to consider many, many other ways of looking at the situation.
Thank you, Venerable. Okay, by the way, I have 3 questions on the floor, but perhaps we can ask your question first, and then we will.
Hi, Professor. Just want to understand, just now you highlight a few points of threaten, driven, and safe. From the explanation, seems to be safe is a good mental situation that we are in. How about the driven one? Because driven one seems to also channel us into a narrow one. But in order to achieve something, or in order to achieve a greater goal for ourselves, even for others, we have to be driven. Sometimes threaten could be good as well, because if not, we will not motivate ourselves to improve and to address the situation.
This is a very important point, and I'm so glad you asked that question, because when I'm talking about threat emotions, drive emotions, and safeness emotions, I don't mean to say this is good and these are bad. That's not what I mean at all. And in compassion-focused therapy, our goal is to help people balance those emotions. Actually, all of these emotions in different situations can be more or less useful, depending on how they fit the situation. Even threat emotions, if there's a legitimate danger, if we're in the street and there's a car racing at us, that surge of fear that motivates us to leap out of the street is very useful. The problem, and I'm a scientist, so the way I talk about things is different from the way Buddhist teachers would talk about. But I talk about these emotions in the context of evolution. And so for example, from that perspective, every one of you, every human sitting in this room represents like the pinnacle of human evolution. There is an unbroken chain of life going back from you to the very origins of life on this planet. If even one of your ancestors had failed to live to reproductive age, you would not be here. What this means is that we, the physical forms of us, we're the sons and the daughters of the ones who survived. And so, from our perspective, those threat emotions evolved because they helped our ancestors deal with the challenges they faced to their survival. The tricky piece is that right now, the way those emotions work, the way anger works, the way fear works, they're suited to physical threats. They're suited to literally having to fight or flee to survive. And almost never in our modern lives are we faced with situations where the best answer is to fight or flee. So it's not that these emotions are inherently bad, it's that they're not very helpful most of the time, and certainly not if we get lost in them. I think the threat emotions right now, they're useful as like signs. This is something I should pay more attention to. This is something I should work with. If someone says something that makes me angry, that teaches me something about me and how I'm understanding how they're treating me that maybe I can then work with. Drive is the same way. If we weren't motivated to achieve, then we'd just play around and not do anything. I mean, there are reasons that when you work toward a goal, when you take an exam and you get an A, you feel good and you're inspired to keep going. There's reasons when you work hard and you make some progress and you see that, you feel good and you want to keep going. So those emotions are very important. The tricky piece is that if we get lost in that drive, what we want, going after the stuff we want, that we can lose sight of the things that are really important to us because our awareness narrows. And it's also true, I think, that the things that our drive system tends to respond to are the things that grant feelings and sensations of immediate pleasure, or things we associate with that: money, food, sex, things like that. So the things we're likely to get carried away in pursuing, the things that actually helped our ancestors survive by gaining social status, which is really important when you're in a situation where the resources are very limited, by finding reproductive partners, the things that allow them to survive. Again, we can get lost into those to the detriment of the things that are really important to us. And things like goals that seem more vague aren't as activating in the same way. So I think the secret is to find ways to balance. So if you're doing a pursuit, when I'm teaching in the classroom, for example, I teach really fun classes like statistics. My students love those classes. My recipe is 3 parts safeness, 2 parts drive, 1 part threat, because I don't know how to make a test of this thing. Right? But you want to balance. And what I find is that when we're struggling, it's usually because we feel too much threat, too much drive, not enough safeness. And it actually turns out, and by the way, when you talk about what happens in the brain, that doesn't make it any more real. And I think neuroscientists make a mistake when they conclude that, oh, we've got an image that shows this lighting up, that makes it real. That's not true. But sometimes it informs us. When we feel safe, there are chemicals that are released in the brain that actually reduce activation in the parts of the brain that cause us to feel threatened or that are associated with feeling threatened. I want to be very careful here because although I do think that things that happen in the brain do exert a very powerful influence on the mind, it's equally true from my perspective that activities of the mind exert an equally and perhaps more powerful influence on the brain. We now know that mental activity, compassion practice, mindfulness practice changes not only activation in the brain, but the very structure of the brain. So the things that Buddhists have been doing for 2,500 years, sometimes it takes science a while to catch up.
That question comes up that you've asked quite a bit. And what I always hear in the question is we need to be angry, like with the threat responses. We need to be angry because if we aren't angry, we can't respond to threat appropriately. And we need to have attachment, otherwise we have no motivation to succeed and do anything. I find that those are kind of the subtext, unspoken, behind the question. And this is what I tend to question, is anger the only motivation that we can feel in order to stop harm? Yeah. Is it? Do we have to be angry in order to protect ourselves or protect others? Yeah. And I don't think so. I think this is where wisdom can come in and see that anger, actually, like he was saying, it's not necessarily appropriate for the situation. Our minds get very narrow. We can't think very clearly. And when we're angry, often our actions don't really protect us in the long term, or they aggravate the situations. When you're having a quarrel with somebody in the family and you get mad, does your anger and what you say calm the situation down and promote communication? Oh, okay. So, I think we can have other kinds of mental states that motivate us to act when we face harm. Okay? And, in a situation of physical harm, not getting out of the way of the car that's coming at you, okay, there's wisdom. Yeah, there doesn't need to be fear or anger, it's wisdom. I need to move. Or wisdom can also be used in other situations. Yeah, it's not wise for me to speak like that because I won't be really communicating and conveying what is important to me. I'm not able to listen when I'm angry, so I need some wisdom in the situation to calm myself down and then deal with it, and in that way intercede when there's harm. Yeah. I think we can also have compassion if we train ourselves well in situations of harm, seeing that the situation is not necessarily just about me. Yeah. that there's other people here with needs and concerns, and if I can meet some of those, it might calm the situation down. Rather than screaming that I need, I want all the time. Okay? Similarly, in terms of drive, people ask me, can Buddhists have ambition? As if, if you're going to be a good Buddhist, you just sit there. I have no attachment. I don't want anything, no attachment. Do whatever you want. You're taking a picture of me looking like that? Oh, no. I'm getting angry. I feel threatened. Give me that camera. That's contraband. Okay. But when of course, we can do things, we can act out of motivations aside from attachment and greed. Yeah. Again, what about motivations of love and compassion? I do something kind because I want others to be happy. Not because I'm going to get something out of it, but because I really care about others. Yeah. What about improving our own skills so that we can be of more and better service to others, instead of so I can make more money and get a promotion? Yeah. So there really are alternative motivations that can spur us, to protect ourselves, to get us to be active in things that are positive concerns.
Thank you, Venerable Professor. Yes, so we have a question from the floor that directly relates to what both of you were saying, so perhaps we could just have one in first. So this question goes, if the other person is a habitually angry and habitually aggressive person, and this person keeps thinking, I'm the one who is trying to be nasty and up to no good, accusing and threatening me, doubting my practice and friends, I'm not complaining, but sorry, this person is my spouse. How do I practice like how Dr. Kolts advises? Thank you.
What was the last thing you said? How do you?
How do I practice like how you advise?
So I think the first thing to recognize when we see someone like this, naturally, it's when someone else is acting like that. It's a little louder again. It's very natural for us to have our own sort of threat response come up. So I think it's very important to recognize that this anger and this hostility, these are threat emotions. And so when you see someone who's doing that, they're not having fun. It may be a habit for them. They've done it so much that that's just the way they habitually are. But I think the first thing we can do if we want to have compassion for them and to work skillfully in the situation is to see that what they're experiencing is actually suffering. That anger is I mean, can you imagine how terrible that would be to be angry all the time? And so I think to have some compassion for that. And it's hard to do that, because in that moment it's very easy to react. When I do my anger workshops, one exercise I do, I won't do it today, but I walk around the room and I have people just pay attention. Our minds react so automatically to anger. I go around and say, you know that I'm not angry with you. You know that I like you. You know that I'm happy. You know that we're just having a wonderful time here at this workshop. And I want you to pay attention to what happens in your body and your mind when I look at you like this. And I walk around the room, and it just turns out I've got German heritage. My natural face assumes an angry. It's very easy for me to look angry. So people notice, even though they know that I'm in no way angry. Did any of you notice that? There's a kind of a desire to pull back, an emotional pulling back. I don't like that. You knew, up here, you knew that it wasn't real, that I wasn't angry, but in those parts of us where our emotions come from, there's a reaction. Even though we know, we can tell ourselves, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe, there's a pulling back. So that's That's very difficult. So I think when that happens, we need to be patient with ourselves, to recognize that it makes sense we're responding to this in this way, and to slow down, to imagine how would the Buddha, how would His Holiness, how would Mother Teresa, whoever, the version of me that is very kind, very wise, completely compassionate, if I imagine having those characteristics, how would I understand this situation? What would I want to do? And from my side, I would encourage compassionate thinking, I think, often involves asking questions. Questions like, what would be helpful here? How can I help him or her feel safe? Because I know that if I come back in anger, that's just going to feel their anger, and then they're going to feel my anger, and we're going to bounce, our threat systems will be bouncing back and forth off each other. But what if I said, that really actually, what you just said to me, that hurt my feelings. You're my spouse, and I care about you, I love you, and when you speak to me that way, it really hurts. And I wanted you to know that. And sometimes even that is enough. Sometimes when we give folks a mirror, just an honest mirror for the affections in their actions, and they see, wow, I'm hurting someone that I actually really care about, that can motivate them to change. Now, if you've got a partner who is struggling with a lot of anger, at that point it can be very tricky. Because when we're someone who's habitually angry and we see that we're hurting people we love, that can sometimes very quickly bring up a sense of shame. I'm bad, I'm wrong, and that can be very, very painful. And when that happens, that's when we do things like we blame the other person. Well, I'd only, da-da-da-da. And so if they come back at us like that, that's when we have to be very steadfast and say, no, you're my spouse and I care about you, and I would like you to treat me more kindly, and I will try to treat you kindly as well. So there's some courage involved in that, because we don't want to cause them to feel more unsafe, because that just fuels the anger. So does that speak to that? Venerable, do you have anything to add?
Yes. Perhaps we can ask the second question that's on the floor. Again, relating to anger. I see we are all preoccupied with emotion. How does righteous anger come into play then? Especially when facing people who are bigoted or discriminatory towards certain groups of people or minorities. How does that allow us to act with compassion?
I'm very suspicious of righteous anger. I'm quite suspicious of it, because what I see is somebody judging somebody else, and getting really stuck in their own identity of, I am good, I am holy, and you are prejudiced. And creating a lot of identity for themselves and for the other, and using that as almost an excuse for venting their own anger at somebody else, because I am right. And as he said, when we're angry, we're always right. We're never wrong. And righteous anger is especially right. Because you have morality on your side, you have God on your side, you have righteousness on your side. So again, I question, people ask this, do we need to be angry in order to stop discrimination, abuse, social ills? No, I don't think that's necessary at all. Back in my university days, when the Vietnam War was going on, I joined some protests. And I remember one protest, the cops were right in front of us, and I was standing next to another person here, and he picked up a brick and threw it at the police. And I went, whoa. this is not in my book, because what I saw is his mind is exactly like the mind of the people he was protesting about. Yeah? So whether it's the police that ready to, you know, attack, as American police are given to, or whether it's the military who's, you know, and doing things they shouldn't be doing in other people's countries. You see, I told you I'm political. So, you know, whatever it is, it's like we've got, that person is unhappy, that person is miserable. We've got to have compassion for them. And we've also, it's important that we don't let our own mind become like theirs. Because if our mind becomes angry like their mind, if our mind becomes closed like their mind, if our mind becomes righteous like their mind, because they feel very righteous too, then we're all in the same boat, drowning together. Yeah? So I think that's when we need to really pull back and look at the situation in a big way. And can I have compassion for everyone involved in this awful situation? Yeah? Can I have compassion? I don't know if you've been reading American. I think the thing about Ferguson is spread. You know about what happened in Ferguson? Okay, so can I have compassion for Michael Brown, the unarmed black teenager who got shot? And can I have compassion for Darren Wilson, the white policeman who shot him? And can I have compassion for the police that overreacted, you know, to the demonstrations? And can I have compassion for the people who burnt down businesses? That's a tall order to stretch our compassion that widely. But I think that when we can, we become more effective in dealing with situations because we realize that it's not an either-or situation. Yeah, the solution is not I dominate them and they give up. Yeah, because if you conquer somebody, the person you conquered is going to be unhappy, and their unhappiness is going to come out towards you in a myriad of other ways. So it's not solving the problem.
So, if you'd like kind of a pithy instruction for how to work with such situations, I'd encourage you, when you notice yourself judging and labeling, try to pause and instead seek to understand. It's tempting. I mean, if you've ever found yourself getting angry, you may have even said, I don't know if you folks say this, but sometimes I have said and hear people say, I have the right to be angry about this, right? I have the right to be angry about this. So I would suggest that you have the right to drink poison too. It's just not very good for you. You see how I mean? And there's actually a study, some researchers look, because this question comes up, this righteous anger question comes up again and again and again. Don't I need anger to be able to confront these terrible problems in the world? And so they looked at anger and activism. And what they found is that there was a link between anger and activism, that actually some activists were motivated by anger, but they only participated in a particular kind of anger, or of activism. Angry activists participated in activism that allowed the expression of anger. So they were much more likely to picket with nasty signs and to scream and yell, but they weren't the ones out making the changes in the world. And so I would encourage you, when this comes up and you notice the anger coming up, there's a lot of reasons for that. But to ask yourself, what do I really want to happen about this problem? If I'm angry about bigotry or prejudice, is my goal to express my anger? Or is my goal to help reduce bigotry and prejudice?
because you can't do both. And if you're expressing anger toward the people that are expressing bigotry and prejudice, you might be actually digging them in to their position even deeper than they were before. On the other hand, if we can understand, and I actually understand this quite deeply, because I was born a heterosexual white male in the middle of the United States. I know. Aversion. So I don't know anything about what it means to be Asian, or African, or Latino, or female, or gay, except insofar as I listen to people who have that experience. And it's very easy because being white and male in our culture means that you're privileged. It means that a lot of the things that affect women and people of color, I don't even see them. You know what I'm saying? They're not even on my radar screen because those obstacles just don't present themselves in my life. And so it was very hard, actually. I wrote an entry about this in Living with an Open Heart. It was very hard for me for a very long time to understand the experiences of people that were different to me. Not because I was bigoted against them or because I didn't like them, but because their experience was so different from my own that I just didn't know the world was like that. I couldn't imagine that this is what it's like. That when you're a woman in the United States, you can't just go out to a music concert and feel safe the way I can when I'm a man. Do you see how I mean? So if I just look at people who are expressing bigotry and say, oh, you're a bad person, and I can be angry at you, not only is that not helping, but I'm completely not getting what's going on in their mind that might be the causes and conditions for those bigotry. But if I pause and instead of judging, seek to understand, if I can understand the causes and conditions for their bigotry, then maybe I can help. Next quarter at EWU, I'll be teaching a class on diversity in therapy. And most of the people in my class are going to be white women. And I know that if I start out by talking about race, their walls are going to go up. They're going to feel very defensive. So instead, I'm going to start talking about gender. And we're going to watch a film that shows the exploitation of women by the media and the way women are characterized and the way women are systematically disempowered relative to men in American culture. And what happens is when you show that, every woman in the room is going. And the guys are going. Right? And what happens is once they do that, once they get that life is different for these people, to those people based on this characteristic, then they can understand that life can be very different based on other characteristics. And then they can feel safe to ask the questions, why is life different and what can we do about it so that some people aren't elevated while other people are pushed down?
This in two parts. So first is attracted by friends to Buddhist class but they decline, how best to spread the word. And then the second part is, I have a great boss. We are very compassionate at work. Great boss sounds rare, but we are very compassionate at work, but we get taken for granted and even mistreated. So how should we respond? Thank you.
What was the first question?
The first one was about inviting friends to Buddhist class and if they decline. So how would we share our ideas with them?
Okay, so you invite a friend to a Buddhist class and they decline. And what do? You say, you're going to hell. But if they don't seem interested in that way, leave a book around the house. You know, but But leave a book around the house, and you know, or leave a book around your workspace, and often people will come up and thumb through it and look at it and find something interesting. I have one friend who's a Buddhist nun, and she was telling me that her sister is a Jehovah's Witness, and one day she, my friend, had left accidentally one of her Buddhist books lying around the house, and her sister had picked it up and read some of it, and then said to my friend, wow, there's a lot of things we have in common. That was like a total revelation to, you know, to the sister. And, you know, so sometimes if you try and tell people things they don't want to hear, but if you give them the conditions where they can learn it by themselves, then they're interested. So it depends on the situation. Some people, they want you to invite them. So go ahead and invite them. Yeah. But if they turn you down, don't feel, you know, offended by it. And if they ask you to go to church, just say no, thank you. No, this doesn't have to be a big deal. And then the second, do you want to say something?
Just very briefly, I think the best way, and I think all of those things are very important because some people do need to be asked in the books and stuff, but I think the best way to interest people in Buddhism is to practice and model and to work with yourself. Because when they see you enacting compassion in your life and kindness, when they see how well it works, and they see that they like the way you're treating them and the way you're living their life, they will be inspired to change themselves. And I think that's what really brings people to Buddhism. When you see that, gosh, you know, I know these people, and there's something about them that I'd like to be more like, and gosh, you know, they're Buddhists. Maybe there's something about that, you know, I think that very helpful.
I think I was reading the second question again, and it goes like this. I have a great boss. We are very compassionate at work, but get taken for granted and even mistreated. How should we respond? So I think the question meant that he or she and the boss are very compassionate people, but other colleagues or even customers might mistreat them because of their compassion. So how should they respond?
I don't know. Because of their compassion piece that you just said, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't think that people generally get mistreated because of their compassion, although if other people sometimes have the habit of taking advantage, that they will act on that. I think when compassion doesn't mean that we're passive. And it doesn't mean we just sit back and take being mistreated. And actually, if you think about it, if we allow others to exploit us or to treat us badly, we're actually contributing to their problem. We're supporting those behaviors in them, right? So I think that sometimes, and quite often actually, compassion means being courageous and saying, look, this is not okay. But the trick is to do it in a way that doesn't cause the other person to feel threatened any more than is naturally going to be the case when someone sort of calls us on our behavior. So I think for me, one of the best ways to do that is to very honestly, and again, I mentioned this earlier, reflect my experience to them. You know, when you say this to me, this is how it feels. And I would like you not to treat me that way. I will treat you with respect. And we got to make sure we're modeling that. We're treating them with respect. And then we can ask them very directly, and I'm treating you with respect, and I would like you to treat me with respect as well. And in doing that, we're confronting the issue, but we're also interacting with them in a way that gives them maybe better awareness of how they're coming across and the opportunity maybe to do better.
I want to second that compassion does not mean you're the doormat. Not at all. Compassion requires tremendous courage. And if somebody is doing something that's harmful, you know, you say something and you can be quite assertive, and let them know what you think, but you can do it with compassion. compassion and without blaming them. You can say this kind of behavior doesn't work in this situation. And also, I would like to add, when you express how you feel to somebody, which is often the last thing we want to do, especially in Asian society, you don't want to say what you just said. It hurt me. It's like, well, that's weak if I say what you said hurt my feelings. To remember that there is strength in expressing yourself. You're not weak when you say how somebody else's behavior affected you. Yeah. You're just saying, this is what my experience is. And if you want to ask them to treat you with respect, I think it's helpful, because saying, please treat me with respect, that person doesn't necessarily know what that means, because they may think they're already doing it. They may not see their own behavior as disrespectful. So it can often be good to say something more specific. Yeah? Like when you want to take a long leave like that, please, submit your request a month in advance or 2 weeks in advance, so it gives us more time to think about it. Yeah. Then that lets them know exactly the behavior that you're looking for, that you consider respectful, but they may not even pick up on that. Okay? So as much as you can be specific, and as much as you can do it as a way of requesting them, instead of, you gotta submit your request for leave, otherwise forget it, we can't consider it. Just, it's like we're all in this together trying to keep the office working, and it's very helpful. Please submit it, the request by this time, and then we can look it over and see how it's going to affect the running of the office.
Thank you, Venerable Professor. We have time for just one last question, so would anyone like to ask final question, please?
Professor, regarding the intensity of our emotion, how it contributes to our survival in a revolutionary sense of intervention, does this post-traumatic disorder and the compulsive disorder has anything to do with the intensity of the experience?
Absolutely. So the question was on post-traumatic stress disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Those disorders are actually very different. So I'll speak very briefly to the second, and then a little less briefly to the first. So with obsessive-compulsive disorder, what drives that actually is a repetitive thought that somebody has. So very commonly someone will have a thought like, oh, I could have left the stove on, my house could burn down. Or I could have germs on my hands, right? And then they're worried about getting disease. And so they usually do a behavior like washing the hands over and over and over, or checking over and over to make sure you didn't leave the stove on. And what's interesting is those methods, the washing the hands or the checking, are actually ways of avoiding the thought. There's something they've learned that actually having that thought is scary. And so they engage in that. And that threat response that evolved to help us respond to real physical danger in the environment becomes linked to a thought. So that when the thought comes up, we experience a feeling of threat. So with that, I think, to help a person develop mindful awareness first of the thought so they notice when it comes up, and then to help them use coping skills to recognize that rather than avoiding the fear that comes up by engaging in whatever this ritual is, I can work with my body maybe to slow down my breathing while I face this fear. And what happens is if you do that over time, the fear will naturally decrease. So, but that is related to that evolved threat response. In post-traumatic stress disorder, something similar happens when we're in situations that are very extreme.
And that can be, for example, the trauma of combat, if you're in a combat situation, or if you were abused, if you were hurt very much by another person, for example, or even if you're in like a terrible accident, something like this. The way our memory works, when our threat emotions go up very high, when we notice ourselves being very afraid, particularly, our memory works different than it normally does. So there are two parts, two structures in our brains that are associated with memory. One of them is very isolated. It takes sensory information like sights and smells and links them very powerfully to emotion. Right? That's called the amygdala. It links them up. And there's another structure called the hippocampus. And what the hippocampus does is it takes all the things that happen in our lives and it weaves them together into a story. It takes them and weaves them together, so ties them together. This is actually very important, actually. There's a study that came out a couple of years ago that shows that 30 minutes of mindfulness meditation, mindful breathing, watching the breath, noticing when your attention wanders and coming back, 30 minutes a day for 8 weeks produced measurable growth in the hippocampus, in the brain, that part of your brain that weaves your experiences together in a story. And so, just to show you how important that is, the narrative that my hippocampus weaves together, I call that Russell. It's a big part of how we come to know ourselves. And in trauma, when arousal becomes very high, the amygdala works very powerfully, and so those sensory emotional memories, so we see something and we feel very strongly, we feel a smell and we feel very strongly, so it's going wild. And when the hippocampus is that hyper-aroused, or the amygdala rather, when it's hyper-aroused, the part of the brain that weaves everything together gets shut down. So we can end up with this situation where we don't remember much of what happened, but we have these very powerful, isolated sensory emotional memories. So we'll see something, and out of the blue, we'll have this rush of emotion. So what happens is that threat system becomes specifically tuned to these reminders of the trauma. And so one of the things we have to do when we're working with someone like that is to help reconstruct their memory, to fill in the gaps so that this event that's so terrifying to them stops being this isolated thing that controls my life and is woven into the fabric of the life. And actually, one way that's really, that can be not very fun, because in some ways it means helping the person go back through the trauma and talk through it, which is not very pleasant. And I actually developed a way of doing this that actually is much more pleasant, where I actually have the person imagine themselves as that compassionate self. Imagine you as having fully realized kindness and wisdom and confidence and compassion. And then we bring up the memory of that trauma that scared them so much. And I have them imagine themselves back there, their compassionate current self, back in the trauma with their vulnerable, scared self, supporting them. And actually have them mentally shift perspectives back and forth. So they're back there imagining the situation, but instead of maybe focusing on the horrible aspects as much, they're focusing on giving compassion and receiving compassion. And what you see, there's some research that's very profound. It shows that when you do that, when you introduce something new during a particular, there's timing that's involved. When you do that, you can actually change the original memory. You can change the emotional tone of the memory itself. And I've had patients who went through this treatment and who came out and say, I remember this event and I remember all the stuff that happened, but now emotionally I feel calm and supported rather than terrified.
So there's a level of acceptance to this situation that's been printed in mind.
Absolutely. I think the acceptance is a big antidote. And part of it's just the understanding, for people to understand some of what I was explaining, to recognize that they're not going crazy. That it's like if you buy an economy car, if you buy a regular car, and you drive it 150 kilometers per hour on the highway, it won't be very long before that car starts breaking down, before glitchy things that happen. And in a way, trauma is like that. For our equipment, our minds, our brains are not designed to operate in environments like that. And when we're subjected to it, particularly on an ongoing way, in the case of someone who is in an abusive situation or in combat, glitchy things happen. And so the acceptance that actually this isn't my fault. This is what happens when you're in a situation like this. And so we have to help people feel safe and then bring compassion to themselves in the situation, help put it in context and understand it.
And to view the responses like depression and things that comes after this as the byproduct of the experience.
Well, depression, these are very complicated questions you're asking, so I'm trying to be brief. But depression can very commonly happen when, as a result of those experiences or other experiences, we have specific types of thoughts that come up in our mind, and very often these are thoughts like, I'm incompetent, I'm flawed, I'm broken, I'm no good, nobody loves me, things like this. And for depression, there's actually quite a lot of literature that shows that a wonderful way to start is to develop mindfulness so you can be aware of those depressing thoughts as thoughts. And you'll notice there's someone up here who actually recently published a book called Don't Believe Everything You Think. and that's a huge part of that. If you tell a depressed person, don't think like that, it's very disheartening for them because they're not choosing to think like that. They're not sitting there going, I think I'm going to tell myself I'm hopeless and helpless today. Right? They learn these thoughts arise in their minds. But if they can recognize the thought as it comes up and to not believe it, and instead recognize, oh, thank you, that's my depression chiming in, but I know that's not true. And then in compassion-focused therapy, I would want to help someone shift their attention to more compassionate ways of thinking. Things like asking questions. What would be helpful? What would help me feel safe? And one of the greatest antidotes to depression is getting people involved in helping others, getting involved in compassionate action, because then they're building a reservoir of things that can help them feel good about themselves. So instead of moving away from what they don't want to be, we want to help them move toward the sort of person they do want to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, His Holiness Dalai Lama, when he heard about how people struggle with self-image, he was very puzzled by the whole thing and wanted to understand it. And then after that, this was in a conference that I heard him talking about that, then after that in his public talks, I noticed that he started recommending when people have low self-esteem, which is associated with depression, when they have that, but then they go and they do some kind of compassionate activity or some volunteer activity or, something that pulls them out of themselves to engage with others. And at first, I was thinking about this, because they always say if you don't love yourself, how can you love others? And so, but His Holiness is telling us to love other people, and but when we don't love ourselves, But when I really thought about it, it's this whole idea of pulling us out of our wrong, fixated mode of thinking and steering our attention to something more positive, like the welfare of others, the feeling of others. What can I do for them? Because when we do something for others, we do feel better about ourselves. Regarding, when we have these kind of negative thoughts about ourselves, I'm a disaster, I'm a failure, nobody loves me, what I find very helpful, because I'm the kind of person, I cannot tell myself to feel something different than what I feel. And it's hard for me also to just say, it's just a thought. Now I can do that, but to get to the point where I can do that and say it's just a thought, I don't have to believe it, I have to really, spend many years going in and asking myself, are those thoughts true? Just because I thought it, is it true? And really examining those thoughts, really with some analysis. Is it true nobody loves me? When you get in that kind of state of mind, oh, nobody loves me. Is that true? And really examining and analyzing and discovering, that's not true. People do care about me. I may want them to show their care in one way and they're showing their care in another way, but they do care. And that's the important thing. So I need to open myself up to experience that instead of getting stuck. What Russell was saying in compassion-based therapy, I want to understand this, that you ask the person to go back in the past situation and be like a friend to themselves.
Yes.
And kind of be there with them as they're going through the situation and processing it again. Okay, so because I express the same idea, slightly different words, okay, is especially when we look at things in the past and we're judging ourselves for how we responded or we're unhappy about it, or we're confused about what happened in the past, to start out with who we are now and look at the person who we were in the past with eyes of compassion, because we understand that person. Yeah, we know what their suffering was. We know what their hurt was. And to have a little conversation with our past self from the viewpoint of our present self, who has more compassion and wisdom. And I find that that's very, very helpful, you know, to do that and show some empathy to who we used to be, show some understanding to who we used to be. Even if who we used to be was acting totally outrageous and obnoxious, to be able to say, oh, I understand why you did that. And to show that understanding, but also to realize that we are not that same person now. We are a different person now. So we don't need to hold on to whatever feelings we had about ourselves in that past situation.
As you were speaking, there were just a couple, again, kind of scientific studies coming up. Venerable Chodron talked about how if we want to be happy, working for the benefit of others is a good way to do it. Actually, there are studies that show that working for the benefit of others creates more happiness in us than working for our own benefit. It actually enhances our happiness more. And the other comment I wanted to make had to do with self-esteem. Self-esteem has come up a couple of times today. And self-esteem about 20, 30 years ago was very popular in psychology. Now we need to help our kids have more self-esteem. How do we help people have more self-esteem? And I actually find that to be quite problematic. And in psychology, we're talking about that a lot less now. Because self-esteem in some ways sets us up to have a competitive sort of orientation towards others, which doesn't really help us feel very steady. If we feel like I've constantly got to do better than you, I've got to compete with you, I've got to look better. Actually, that can interfere with us. And there's a recent study that looked at self-esteem and self-compassion. And self-compassion is just about how you relate to yourself when you see yourself suffering or struggling. Do you relate with judgment or condemnation, or with the same kindness that you would relate to other people? I'm willing to bet here is it's always like this with mental health professionals. I'm betting it's like this with a lot of Buddhists too. I'm willing to bet there are a lot of people in this room that when you observe yourself struggling or having different emotions or having thoughts that don't fit with who you want to be, I would bet that you say things to yourselves, some of you, that are far more cruel than you would ever say to any other person. You know, you say things to yourself that you would never say to anyone else. And so I would challenge you, actually, if you observe yourself doing that, don't beat yourself up for beating yourself up, but just try to notice what you're doing and see. We can do that too. We can condemn ourselves we get them loose. Instead, what if you just, when you see yourself struggling or suffering, just try to relate yourself with the same kindness and compassion and support that you would to anyone who you saw in that condition. And one study that looked at this showed that actually self-compassion, just being able to relate warmly to yourself when you were struggling or suffering, was far more related to happiness than was self-esteem. And for the nerds like me here,
if you statistically control for self-compassion, there is no effect of self-esteem.
I want to ask. My definition of self-esteem seems to be different than yours. Because for me, self-esteem has not, to have good self-esteem, you have to stop comparing yourself to others. And then having good self-esteem, or raising children with self-esteem, means not comparing them to other people. That's how I look at it.
There are, I suspect, some differences in the way psychology would define it as to the way Buddhism would. In spirit, I agree with what you're saying, but what we find is that there's kind of a slippery slope, where self-esteem in psychology is really defined by a sense of, I'm good. I'm, a sense of being happy with who I am, in a sense of I'm a good, efficacious person. And it's very easy, in practice, it seems, for that to slip into comparing, because it's I'm good in comparison to what. Now, if I were you, I might be thinking, well, that doesn't sound like real self-esteem, and I would agree. I would agree with that. But the problem is self-esteem as a concept is not as well defined. And so what a lot of people have tried to do in teaching self-esteem actually isn't teaching what you just described as self-esteem. It's teaching, for example, people that, that everything they do is great. Right? One of the missteps of the self-esteem movement was you tell your kids, my son, I remember, we went to a Christmas thing at my wife's work, a work party, and they had these different rooms with activities for young people. And one of them was a finger painting area, and my son was about 2 at the time. And Dylan went in and he created he touched all the paints and he moved it together. And at the end, he had this picture that was like a big brown blob. It looked like a bird poop or something, But did the person who was working there, did she say to him, "Oh, you had so much fun making that picture"? Did she say that? No. You know what she said? "That's a beautiful picture. You should be an artist." So I think one of the missteps of the self-esteem movement is just telling people everything you do is great. And that's a terrible thing. That cripples people, because then we think that everything should come easy for us. And so I think my real answer is that self-esteem isn't as well defined. But even taking it as a general sense of I'm happy with me, it seems to be more important how we relate to ourselves when we're struggling or suffering. It seems to be more important to not kick ourselves when we're down than to build ourselves up.
That's interesting. Thank you for explaining that. Because for me, self-esteem involves self-acceptance. It starts out with self-acceptance. So I have to accept that I'm talking too much. But I'm going to keep talking. I have compassion for you, dealing with me. Yeah, because for me, self-esteem really involves self-acceptance. What I am, what I have, what I do is good enough right now in this present moment. Of course I can improve in the future. Yeah, but to give myself a break and stop all this rotten kind of self-judgment by giving myself some empathy, some compassion, some acceptance. And I think that self-acceptance really is important in order to have compassion. Yeah, because otherwise we have a kind of, we become compassionate in quotations so that we can think good of ourselves. Again, not because we really care, but because compassion you know, oh, I'm so compassionate, you know, becomes a way of not looking at what we don't like in ourselves. Instead of facing what we don't like within ourselves with some tolerance and acceptance and empathy and compassion, and knowing that we can and will change in the future.
Thank you very much.